So welcome everybody to one of the events in our International Women's Day programme. I'm Professor Helen Cowie. I'm based in the Department of History, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this wonderful talk by Sarah Lonsdale. I actually work on the history of animals, particularly llamas, but I'm really interested in the history of natural history and exploration, so I'm really looking forward to hearing more about Sarah's fascinating book. We're delighted to be part of York International Women's Week 2025, which runs from the 3rd to the 9th of March. This programme offers 40 mostly free events organised by and for the local community. And these include talks on crafting, wellness workshops, exhibitions, open mics, clothes swaps, and local and global activist events. So there's a whole plethora of things that you can get involved in. So if you're interested, please check out the full programme of events on www.yorkwomen.org.uk. And if you enjoy our open lectures at the university, please have a look at our second event celebrating International Women's Day, which will come up on Tuesday the 25th of March. And in this case, we'll be welcoming the author Lois Shearing to talk about her new book, Pink-Pilled, Women and the Far Right. Today, though, we're really delighted to welcome historian Sarah Lonsdale to speak to us this evening. Sarah is a senior lecturer in journalism at City University of London. She's a writer for the Times Literary Supplement, History Today, and the Sunday Times. She's also the author of several books, the most recent of which she's here to talk about today, and that is Wildly Different: How 5 Women Reclaimed Nature in a Man's World. The book traces the lives of 5 women who fought for the right to work in, enjoy, and in some cases to help save Earth's wild places. Sarah's here to tell us more, and afterwards we'd also love to get some questions from you. So welcome, Sarah.
Thank you everybody for coming tonight. Thank you so much to the University of York and York Women for hosting me. This book's been 5 years in the making, and it's been sitting inside my head, kind of crying, screaming to get out. And so it's so lovely to be able to talk about it tonight. So thank you so much for coming. So I'm going to tell you start a little bit by telling you how the book evolved, why I thought about writing it, why I wanted to write it. And then I'm going to talk to you about the 5 women who are in the book. I'm going to do a couple of readings as well. So I'm going to start by telling you how it all began. And I'm going to take you back to the dim, distant days of the 1970s, when I was a little girl, and I used to sit next to my mum. She was brilliant at reading, and every night was one of my favourite times of the day. I was sleepy and in my dressing gown, and she would sit. There was this little pool of light, just me and her, and she would tell me these wonderful stories. She'd read stories to me about brave knights going off on quests, princes going off to rescue princesses in their castles, brave herdsmen fighting dragons and that kind of thing. And I loved them all. And then she read me this book that I loved more than any of the other books. It's a story from northern Norway called East of the Sun and West of the Moon. And if you haven't read it, it's again one of those classic adventure stories where a protagonist goes out from their village to rescue someone who's stuck in a castle. But this time, the protagonist was a little girl. And she left her village on the back of a polar bear, and both of them ranged across the northern Norwegian ridges, through forests, along high mountains, seeking advice from the north wind and from wise witches to find out this castle where she was to rescue a prince. And it was completely transformational for me, because I thought, I can do this too. I can go off and have adventures. It's not just something for boys and for men. And just a few years later, I was actually, my parents took me to Snowdonia, and I was doing the Crib Goch arete, which, if you don't know it, it's a very, very knife-edged ridge, very, very steep-sided, and I was absolutely terrified. But I pretended I was this girl on the back of the polar bear, and she gave me courage, and I shouted, "I'm not afraid," even though I was completely terrified. That was sort of the start of things, and then I remember very clearly we had a lesson at school once. It was a religious lesson, and I was told about this mountain in Greece where the priests, the male priests, had ordained that women couldn't go there. And me and my friends, we said, that's not fair. Why aren't we allowed to go into this mountain? And so we rushed to the library and did a bit more research. And we found that there were not just this mountain in Greece, but other sacred, so-called sacred sites around the world where women weren't allowed to go. And really weirdly, you know, we found that there was this Japanese mountain where women were banned, and the reason why they were banned was because there were caves in this mountain that looked like women's wombs. And we thought, how weird is that? That there's this mountain which has the anatomy of a woman, but women aren't allowed to go there. So all these things, that was weird, and they sort of percolated away, this idea that women aren't allowed to go to certain places, that in these myths, you know, there's King Arthur and his knights, there's the myth of Gilgamesh, which is the oldest story ever written down, where Gilgamesh and his friend Enkidu go adventuring, these kind of self-making quests. The only women or females that you find in these wild places are either supernatural goddesses or witches or gorgons, or if they are human women, flesh and blood women, they're often there because they've been banished, because they've disobeyed social rules about what women are supposed to do or not supposed to do. So, for example, there's this Greek myth of Polyphonte, who she wanted to be a huntress, and she wanted to go off into the forest and hunt, like Artemis. But of course she was going against the ordained gender assignment, which is that, you know, in Greece, ancient Greece, where very high mortality rate for infants and mothers, every single woman had to have babies, and she didn't want to do that, and so she was cursed and banished and turned into a flesh-eating owl. And so you can imagine, if you're a young Greek girl listening to this, you know, there's no way you're going to disobey those laws and rules which say you stay at home and you do what you're supposed to do. So I decided that I wanted to investigate this further, because obviously women have lived alongside men in the wild ever since we were early hominins and hunter-gatherer societies. Men and women live in forests and in wild places, and I wanted to look at where this idea that women shouldn't leave the village or shouldn't leave the city wall or the castle, and that it's only that men go out on these sort of self-making quests. And so I looked around for these women who did break out and who did find a way of disobeying, I suppose, what society said about what women should do and where they shouldn't go. And so I'm a 20th century historian, so it made sense that I looked across the sort of the long 20th century, and of course, over the course of the 20th century, women have gained much in terms of their right to vote. We've had prominent female politicians. We've had women going to the Antarctic, although actually I have to say that studies of women on the fieldwork bases in Antarctica are not encouraging because they report that they feel othered and they are harassed by men on the bases, as if still to this day, that women aren't supposed to go to these wild places. But also, of course, the wild, and what is the wild? And one of the things I wanted to do was work out what the wild is and what our relationship with the wild is. The wild has been in retreat over the last 100-odd years as well. We've chopped down forests and forests of trees. We've poured concrete over the land. Some of our big cities take days to cross on foot. And so I wanted to get an idea of, as we go through the 20th century, whether our relationship with the wild is changing as well. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of my 5 women. And the first one is Mina Hubbard. She was a Canadian woman. She was the daughter of Irish farmers who'd fled the potato famine, and she trained to be a nurse. She left school at 19 and trained to be a nurse. In 1905, she found herself deep in the Labrador wilderness, right far northeastern part of Labrador, and it was a very inhospitable terrain. The summer's very short. You can start, the lakes can start to freeze over sort of in July, August time. She was there with her 4 guides. Some were First Nations, some were mixed race, Cree and Montagnais guides. And she was there because 2 years earlier, her husband had been there and he had died of starvation. It's still it was a very dangerous place to go. It was one of the last so-called wildernesses of northern Canada. Now, of course, it was a wilderness to the sort of the white male narrative, the explorers who were still in that settler mode, going off to conquer new territory and map it and claim it. But of course it wasn't wilderness at all. It had been home for centuries to the First Nation Americans who had lived there, and their presence was there all around. The fishing weirs and the portage routes and the stone hearths were all there to be seen. But the men of the sort of outdoor North American exploration fraternity saw this as a terra incognita, that nobody had been there before. And Mina's husband went off. He wanted to seek fame and glory by mapping the source of the Nascaupi River, one of the few rivers that had yet to be mapped formally by the American Geographical Society. And he went off there, but very sadly he died of starvation. And so she wanted to complete his work. And you might have thought, well, people would say, good on you, finishing your husband's work. What a great thing to do. She wanted to find the caribou migration, and she wanted to meet some Montagnais and Cree Indians while she was there. But this is the kind of greeting she got when she decided that she wanted to do. She got absolute opposition. How dare she, a woman, go off into the wild? Why does she think that she can do a job that killed a man, killed her husband? And they portrayed her as this sort of grief-stricken, hysterical widow, they really didn't want her to succeed at all. This is the front page of the New York Times, and this was published on the day that she got to her halfway point as she found the headwaters of the Naskaupi River, and they said she'd given up, and she hadn't at all. And in fact, she did succeed in getting all the way to the Arctic coast, and she did draw the most fabulous map of the area, which for many decades later was still being used by people. Now, I haven't got it, it's not a very, very good reproduction here, but this is part of her map. Now, you have to remember that Mina wasn't a trained cartographer, she wasn't a trained surveyor, and this is a very interesting map because it's a story of two journeys. It's told in two times. You can see 1903 there. That is her husband's journey, that he went up. The reason why he died was because he went up the wrong river. He went up the Susan River, which was very, very difficult to navigate, when the Naskaupi was the upper river going up there. So she drew her map as a story. Two timelines, the story of how her husband died and how she then went off. And you can see the cross there, the camp where Leonidas Hubbard died with a little cross. And there it's so, you know, on the actual map it's less than a centimetre, agonisingly close. She's marked where George Elson found the flower. So when her husband was ill, George Elson, one of the guides who went with him, ran back to try and find a cache of flour that they'd laid for their return journey to try and find it. And so this map is like a story of how her husband died and how agonisingly close he was to getting more food that might have prevented his death. And obviously it's not a conventional map because it's a story. It's not just about topography. And I think what's really interesting about Mina's map is that there are parallels. Now, I'm not saying by any means that we can really compare. So this is a map drawn by a First Nation Beothuk woman about 100 or so years before Mina drew her map. She was part of this Beothuk nation that was completely wiped out by French and English settlers. And before she died, she was taken into captivity in Newfoundland, and she would draw her maps of her life. And this is another map, which isn't your classic sort of topography map, but she has done two different timelines as well. She's done a timeline of the English coming in, and then she's done another timeline at the top of where her aunt was taken by English soldiers. And I think it's really interesting that, as I say, you can't really compare them, but they can reflect on each other, that these two women, neither of whom were sort of trained in map making, have used their map in a very different way to that of a military surveyor or someone coming to claim land. It's telling a story, which I thought was so interesting. Moving on now to Evelyn Cheesman. Evelyn Cheesman was born and brought up in Kent, quite near where I live actually, and I was very lucky to go and see the childhood garden where she grew up. She grew up in the North Downs in Kent, and her parents were very fond of their 5 children, but very neglectful. And they let the kids just go roaming around the garden, go roaming around the North Downs. And Evelyn's love of the natural world was born. These long walks she went out with her dog. She used to collect snails, Roman snails, and let them loose in the house, and their beautiful silver filigree trails were left all round the house. She collected glowworms and put them in jars and kept them on shelves in her bedroom, and she would lie awake at night and watch their tiny starry lights light up her room. And she was absolutely determined to spend her life with animals, with the natural world. She applied to study at the Royal Veterinary College, but unfortunately they didn't take women at that time, and they rejected her. So she applied again under a pseudonym, but they recognised her handwriting, and so they rejected her again. Anyway, as with many women, her big sort of opportunity came during the First World War, when a lot of people went away to fight, and a vacancy arose at the London Zoo. So the keeper of insects at London Zoo had gone off to the trenches, and the very superior curator of insects at London Zoo wanted someone to do the dirty work, to come and clean out the cages and feed the animals and that kind of thing. So Evelyn, who knew this man's cousin, leapt at the chance. So she turned up terribly excited. Finally, she was going to get the chance to do her work with insects that she wanted to do, only to find that because of rationing and because of shortages during the First World War, there was one lonely aquatic beetle swimming around a pond in the insect house, and that was all there was. So she would go off with her butterfly net and her fishing net to ponds all around London, and she would scoop out mayfly larvae, and she'd catch moths and try and make the exhibits at the zoo a bit more interesting to people. She went to Covent Garden fruiterers and begged when a sort of hairy spider came off a cargo of bananas or something, she would grab it and take it and put it in the zoo. But still, after the end of the war, people wanted a bit more excitement than a few kind of brown moths and things like that. So she got on a collecting trip to go to the South Pacific. It was dubbed the kind of second voyage of the Beagle, Charles Darwin's expedition, because it went to the Galapagos and it went to the island of Gorgona, which is just off Colombia. And I'm going to do my first reading, which is we find Evelyn Cheesman on the island of Gorgona on this trip. She doesn't feel really very much at home there, because she's the only woman amongst 8 scientists on the trip, and there are also many amateur naturalists, and one of them was a man who took her large insect collecting screen. And also there was a woman chaperone who went along with her, and this man took this woman to be his assistant. So she felt already that she was being undermined and eased out. But she was where she wanted to be. She was in this extraordinary country which absolutely enchanted her. The island was full of noises and snakes. The sawing and whining of unseen insects and tree frogs, a symphony of tiny drills, counterpointed the constant drip of water permeating through layers of leaves. All was mossy fringe, tendril, spike, pod, scale, and beneath it all the shuddering boom of the Pacific waves coming to rest against the shore. Gorgona, just off the coast of Colombia, is an island rainforest. The mahogany, balsa and banyan figs, as well as the orchids, epiphytes and tropical ferns in trees 8 stories tall, harbour more than 400 species of reptile, many deadly. The snakes inspired Spanish explorer Diego de Almagro in 1524 to name the uninhabited island Gorgona after the serpent-haired women of Greek myth who could turn men to stone with one murderous look. Evelyn Cheesman had no time to consider cartographical etymology or the monstrous feminine of ancient poets' imaginings. She was trapped in the bonds of a giant spider's web from which no chewing or tearing with her teeth and fingers could release her. The more she tugged, the more the silk, stronger in tensile strength than steel, cut into her hands. While she was too large to be considered a meal for the spider, the sight of its shriveled and decidedly post-mortem gecko hanging from the skein in front of her was not encouraging. She'd been trapped like this for over an hour, having momentarily lost concentration as she wandered through this strange country that thrilled her with its tintinnabulating life. Although it was the middle of the day and the equatorial sun was at its peak, beneath the vaulting tree canopy, it was a damp, twilight world where shafts of light sieved through the greenish gloom. This was her first trip into the wild, beyond her childhood roaming in the hills and woods around her home, and things had started badly when she stunned a snake and put it in her belt pocket thinking it was dead. She had designed and made the heavy cotton pockets herself for collecting specimens. She had to endure first the snake's drowsy reawakening and then its increasingly frantic wriggling for several hours until she worked out how to remove it without being bitten. She had joined this scientific expedition to the South Pacific in order to gather exotic species for the Zoological Society of London, where she was curator of the insect house. When she'd started work as a lowly keeper at the zoo in 1917, wartime visitors seeking escape from the food shortages and relentlessly grim news were satisfied with the paltry collection of native mayflies. Now, 6 years after the end of the First World War, the public was demanding more to see than the bugs she had scooped out of home county's ponds and hedgerows. So that's just a little insight into Evelyn on Gorgona. She did manage to escape the spider's web because she found her little metal nail file in the hem of her jacket pocket, and she managed to saw herself free. But she also, possibly more dramatically than that, by accident sent a poisoned tipped spear to none other than King George V, which probably deserves a little bit of explanation. So part of her collecting, she went to the New Hebrides, and there's an island there called Molecular, and she made friends with the king on Molecular called King Ringapat, and he invited her into his village. Interestingly, he had 17 wives, and none of them were allowed outside the village. But she was known as the medicine woman because she brought them quinine, because malaria was very, very rampant on the island. Anyway, she showed a photograph of her King George V to King Ringapat, and he said, well, I must give your king a gift. You choose what to give him. So he showed her various items, and she chose this 15-foot long spear, which was about 3 times her height. Here's a close-up of this rather terrifying carved wooden head just before you get to the tip of the spear. And she sent it back via P&O to London. While she carried on her collecting, she said, what can I give you in return? And he said, I want 2 drums of oil. And when she got back to London, she had 2 drums of oil sent to him in gratitude. But the king's equerry was a little bit anxious about this spear turning up and asked the people at the Natural History Museum to test it. And lo and behold, they found that it was covered in strychnine poisoning, which had been used. There were wild pigs on molecular, and that's what they hunted. And so they had the spear boiled in oil, boiled in alcohol, boiled in hydrochloric acid, boiled in water. But still, unfortunately, the king said, "Thank you very much, but I don't think I'm going to accept this." So it was sent to a warehouse in London where lots of the British Museum's artefacts are kept, and I managed to track it down, and it is extraordinary to feel and be close to an object that one of your heroes had handled. So that was a wonderful experience. She was also a fabulous illustrator. This is a wonderful picture of a centipede that fell into her soup along with a gecko it had killed one day. She was always broke, and so she made money by writing children's books and writing sort of pot boilers, she called them, because after she left the zoo, she worked for the Natural History Museum for free as a volunteer, and so she supported herself by selling books, doing radio programs. There's a wonderful radio program recorded in 1956, a BBC program where she is on the radio with a very young David Attenborough and a very young Gerald Durrell as well, and it's wonderful to hear her talking to our great wildlife hero, David Attenborough, and he's got this quite high chirruping voice, and she had terrible asthma all her life. She's got this great deep husky voice, and it's really interesting to hear them together. So that is a little bit about Evelyn, and here is Dorothy Pilley, the mountaineer. Absolutely fantastic picture there of her holding a rope. Now, you probably wouldn't know that, but in the 1920s, to see a woman holding a rope was actually quite a radical thing, because women weren't allowed to climb using ropes unless they were led by a man. And she pioneered something called manless climbing, where she and other women would go off, often in secret, and climb alpine peaks using ropes without men, and then announce it afterwards. She formed the world's first feminist climbing club and she was founding editor of its journal, The Pinnacle Club. The Pinnacle Club is still in existence today. And she provided with the journal a platform for women to write about the wild, something that, again, that was a very rare thing. Most of women's wilderness writing is often kept in diaries, in letters, not published. I mean, even to this day, 94% of all published mountaineering memoirs are male-authored. So for her to provide a platform for women to write about the wild was, again, a very radical thing to do. These are her beautiful ice axes that are kept at the Alpine Club in London, and I wanted to see them because one of her most impressive climbs was when she climbed the northwest ridge of the Dent Blanche in 1928. It had never been climbed before. People had tried, but they hadn't been able to. And it's a very, very difficult climb. At one point, you have to hoist yourself under the eave. It's like a nose, under the eave of a rocky nose, and somehow get up and over the bridge of the nose and climb up an almost sheer for 200 feet. The only way to do that, to get up from under the nose, is you have to bury your axe handle into the rock and use the end of it to spring off, literally into nothing. 3,000 feet of nothing beneath you. She did this, and she and her party of her 2 guides and her husband, I.A. Richards, they were the first people ever to do it. And she kept this diary. She was a wonderful diarist. She kept a diary every day of her life from the age of 12 to when she died at the age of 92. And she wrote about this amazing day where she had been terrified and freezing cold. Ivor Richards had gone up before her, up and over this ridge, and he looked down and he said to himself, and he wrote in her diary, he said, "I do not think that Dorothy can survive. I don't know how she can survive." It happened almost in a dream, she said, and sometimes she was just balancing with a toe and a finger for 200 feet up this almost sheer rock face. So it's wonderful to be able to see her ice axes. Here's the Pinnacle Club journal. That's on the right. I wanted to show you this because this is the famous picture, Caspar David Friedrich, of the monarch of all I survey image of the man at the top of a mountain. And it's very clear that the Ladies' Alpine Club, which was very much a sort of subordinate of the Men's Alpine Club, didn't want to rock the boat. There she is. She's very much mimicking that picture. But when you come to the Pinnacle Club, here she is. She's on her own. She's got a long way to go. And she's got a rope. She's on her own, and she's got a rope around her shoulders, and that's saying, I'm going to use a rope, and I don't care who knows it as well. So that is the Pinnacle Club. And I'm going to read you a little bit of that great day when Dorothy was climbing up the Dent Blanc, because it was a very tricky climb. Sorry, I've lost my place now. She was wearing the wrong boots. Dressing by candlelight on the dark alpine hut, she had mistakenly put on an old one with worn nails, and the other wasn't even hers and several sizes too big. It made her right foot an ounce or two heavier than her left, giving her a slight, ungainly gait as she crossed the glacier. When she realized her mistake, she didn't dare suggest they return to change. It was a cause too much delay. And this was supposed to be her greatest day, the climb of her life. It was also the most perilous. The Dent Blanche is one of the most difficult and dangerous mountains in the Alps. And although at times, in her heartbroken years in Canada, she had deliberately courted oblivion in those summits, it would be losing too much to slide off the face of the earth now. Too late to go back. They were already 5 hours into the day, which began cold and black at 1 o'clock in the morning. It was July 1928, and down in the valleys, the gentians and violas were a blazing, bee-humming sea of blue and indigo. But up here at over 11,500 feet, it was another world, freezing, quiet, monochrome. At first, the snow above the bricklayer hut had been granular and dry, and the old nails gripped as the boots creaked over it, just enough. But as the party of 4, 3 men and 1 woman, rose slowly across the Dent Blanche glacier, Dorothy's feet slipped over the ice. They were now roped together, and every time a foot shot out, she was aware of tugging, either at the man behind her or the man in front, testing his balance and patience. The glaciers were in a rotten state that hot summer. Swampy, she called them, thawing and refreezing multiple times as the sun's rays strafed the high passes. Crevasses suddenly opened like blue cathedrals beneath apparently solid snow. Climbers would disappear into the mountain like offerings to the deity, sometimes never to be seen again. Please God, it didn't happen to her. She was only too well aware of her guide Joseph's views on women climbers. So that's a little bit about Dorothy. And I'll move on to Ethel Haythornthwaite, who some of you may be familiar with. She lived in Sheffield, and she was the whole reason, really, why the Peak District became the first national park and the most powerful national park as well. So back in the 1930s, when the movement to create national parks was being formed, a committee, the Addison Committee, was formed, and a list of areas of Britain that should become a national park was drawn up. And you had the Peak District, you had the Lake District, you had Snowdonia, you had the Pembrokeshire coast, but the Peak District wasn't on the list. The reason being was that much of the upland moors in the Peak District were owned by the Dukes of Norfolk, Devonshire and Rutland, and they wanted to keep them private because of the grouse shooting there. And so they lobbied hard to make it that the Peak District was not on the list. And there was a lot of snobbery there too. So the Peak District is between Manchester and Sheffield, and at the time they didn't want the hatless, singing, yellow-jerseyed mill workers coming and traipsing all round their moors. And this is a map of the Peak District area. You can see Manchester and Sheffield, and there's only a few footpaths longer than 2 miles long, public footpaths, lots and lots of blank areas there, which is where the grouse moors were. And so you could only get to see some of the beauties of the Peak District if you trespassed, and if you trespassed you got fined. Ethel did a lot of trespassing herself. So she had been widowed in the First World War and went into a really deep, severe bout of mental distress after her husband was killed. And she said that she went to bed every night not wanting to wake up in the morning. But she was from a very strongly Methodist family, and obviously to think like this was a sin. And she got deeper and deeper into this black mood and black feeling, and it was only because her sister Gertrude would take her out, said, "Come on, we're going to go for a walk." And they went off, they went up Kinder, Scout, they went up Frogget Edge, Bleak Low, and little by little, she said, and the best days were when it was stinging sleet in her face. It managed to pour some life into her, and she saved, she says that the Peak District saved her life. And as a result, she was going to fight to save the Peak District for the rest of her life, which is what she did. And the story of how she managed to get the Peak District from absolute no chance to not just any national park, but the first national park, which had many more powers than subsequent national parks, was due to her amazing networking, hard work. She attended so many committee meetings, and during the Second World War, she pretty much ran the CPRE, the Council for the Protection of Rural England, on her own. And miraculously, during those several months she ran the CPRE, which had been tasked to draw up this final list of parks, the Peak District appeared, and then went to the top of the list. And so that is a story, a very different story. So whereas Dorothy Pilley wasn't afraid of a bit of confrontation, Ethel worked very, very hard and quietly and assiduously. And so My final character is Wangari Maathai, who in the 1970s formed this group called the Green Belt Movement. As I said in the introduction, during this time, the last 100-odd years, the wild has really been under attack. And Wangari Maathai grew up under British colonial rule in the highlands of Kenya. She said it was very lush country. You could scoop up balls of earth in your hand and squeeze it, water would come out, it was like clay. And she would play underneath these great fig trees, which were sacred to the Kikuyu, and she would fish for tadpoles, and the water would run clear and sparkling out of the roots of the trees. But back by the time it was the 1970s, she was an academic at the University of Nairobi, and they were campaigning for the first UN Women's Summit. Women from the Aberdare Highlands, where she grew up, came and said, we need water, we need food. Our country has been devastated by soil erosion. And she realised that actually her fight, rather than to better the conditions of women academics at Nairobi University, she needed to help fight for the soil of Kenya that was being washed into the sea. This great red soil, she said it looked like sort of blood was pouring into the Indian Ocean, and it was her country. And so she founded this movement to plant 30 million trees across Kenya. Now, when she started her work in the 1970s, less than 2% of the forest, of the landmass of Kenya was forested. Now that's well below the UN minimum, which is supposed to be about 10% to stop kind of ecosystem collapse. Now it's about between 12 and 13%, because she really started this movement. They have a Wangari Maathai Day every year. We've just had it, they really took her to their heart. Eventually, she did actually, while she was trying to encourage people to stop tearing down the forests of Kenya, she came up against Daniel Arap Moi, the president of Kenya, and she challenged him over the deforestation. He was parceling off forests in Kenya and giving them to his supportive cronies, and they would literally come in and they would bulldoze great swathes of virgin forest, and then overnight Wangari and her friends in the Green Belt movement would come with little bags of tree seedlings and try and replant the devastated forests. And she was attacked, she was imprisoned. At one point she had a terrible head wound which caused her to have 4 stitches, and she signed her police statements in her own blood. You can see her because she's the most recent, lots and lots of video footage of her, and she's normally very calm, very persuasive, but she was absolutely furious that she'd been attacked for the simple act of planting trees. And I know I'm running out of time here, but just to say that as well as the forest cover, so Karura Forest on the edge of Nairobi was a kind of dead forest. It was a monoculture of eucalyptus and cypresses started off by the colonial government to provide firewood for the railway that went from Mombasa to inland. Lots and lots of indigenous species had vanished. But very recently, they're very happy to announce that the African crowned eagle has now returned to Karura because of the work that Wangari Maathai started. And I think that's probably a good place to stop.
Please join me. Thank you, Sarah, for your wonderful rich talk. We've got a few minutes left for questions. If anybody has one that they would like to ask, I will ask you to speak into a microphone. We are recording this event, so this is so that it can be recorded for later. Has anybody got a question that they would like to ask? While you're pondering, I will kick us off. Oh, there is one. Well, ponder away. We've got one down at the front here.
Thanks, Sarah, for that. It's a very short question. What does wildness mean to you?
Very good question. I think it's a personal thing. I think for me, it's somewhere where you can go where if you're so busy trying to cling on to a rock face or keep your head above water in a raging river, or you're so far away that you're not worrying about how to pay the next bill or something like that, where the sort of social and political and legal system doesn't get you because nature is so much more powerful than any sort of political structure. And it's where you can think about, really about some of the fundamentals of life. And I think it's also helps you feel at peace, I think, as well, because you're not worrying about what other people think of you or all that kind of thing. So that's what it means to me.
Any other questions? Oh, they're all popping up. We've got one there just at the back, and then the lady here as well.
Hi, I was wondering what's the inspiration for your book, and how did you come across the women? Like, what came first? Did you want to write a book, or did you find the women?
So thank you for that question. So as part of my research for my previous book, which was a lot to do with looking up old newspapers, I found this newspaper headline, which was "Woman collects 42,000 insects." And it was a newspaper article about Evelyn Cheesman in 1934. And I thought, oh, she sounds interesting. So I sort of put that away. And then also in my previous book, I had written about Dorothy Pilley before, and her role as a journalist and bringing out this publication. But I only had a little bit of space for her. It was there were lots more women in that book, and I only had one chapter for her. And I really felt that Dorothy was unfinished business, because not only was she a brilliant writer, but she was this incredible sportswoman and mountaineer, and I wanted to learn more about her. As I say, she'd kept these diaries, and she was very forthright in her diaries. She was a wonderful gossip, and they were wonderful things to go away and read. Also, she had a very interesting personal life. So she climbed with her husband, I.A. Richards, and they did have eventually a very happy marriage, but she spent about 10 years of her 20s basically saying, no, I don't want to marry you, even though she loved him. And in her archive, as well as her diaries, there are these incredibly long, 60-page long letters of rejection, why I can't marry you. And I thought, she's such an interesting character. So I wanted to learn more about Dorothy. And then I got this idea, and as I say about my childhood, this idea that there are some wild parts of the world that women aren't allowed, or thought they weren't allowed, or in myth, or prevented from going to. And I just wanted to sort of draw all those different ideas together in the book.
Brilliant, thank you, Sarah. The lady there had a question. Just wait for the microphone.
Hi. Just a question about the last lady, Wangari Maathai. I was wondering, was it particularly significant, do you think, that she was a woman? Would a man, on his own, have faced the same difficulties, ended up in prison for wanting to stop soil erosion, because it's a battle that still goes on?
I think I didn't get to say, thank you very much for your question, I didn't get to say enough about her really, but the attacks on her were very, very gendered. They talked about her being a woman with insects in her head, about how dare she got divorced, and she was, Arap Moi himself said she's a disobedient woman, don't listen to her, and her whole work with the Green Belt, it wasn't just about tree planting, it was about empowering the rural women of Kenya, who often were left behind while the men went off to Nairobi to get work, and they were often left very impoverished, having to walk miles and miles for water, having to watch their children die of malnutrition. And she wanted to find a way to help empower them, and so she formed this very ingenious idea, which I think probably is comes from her being a woman, in that she would pay them to grow these trees in the nurseries, and every tree that grew to maturity, they would get paid a certain amount. She didn't expect them to work for free, and her work was all bound up with empowering women. And as I say, the attacks on her were very, very centred on the fact that she was a woman. How dare this woman stand up and confront the power structures in our country.
Any other questions? Yes, just over there.
Have you faced much criticism for only focusing on women in this book?
Criticism in what way?
Just from anyone that's seen advertised, I guess, and has anyone asked you why you've only focused on women and not understood the point of it?
Not yet. I think it's generally accepted that, as I say, lots and lots of books are written about male explorers, male mountaineers, male scientists, and we're still doing this work of uncovering women's voices and women's lives, much of which are kept behind closed doors and not known about. So I think there's plenty of room for books about women as well as about men.
Absolutely. As we were saying, there are many books about men, and people probably wouldn't say, where are the women? And sadly not. But any other questions anybody would like to? Yes, we've got a gentleman there.
Thank you. These women, as well as lots of people in this room, no doubt, have a huge affinity and sensitivity for nature. And I wondered whether, in the writing of the book and learning about these people and in your own experiences, whether you had come up with any insights that we could pay forward to all of the people that don't have that same affinity for nature and all of the costs that has in our lives today.
Thank you. I think one of the things that really moved me about my research into this book was the way they wrote about their own relationship with the natural world. So, for example, Dorothy Pilley, she wrote about how well her body fits the rocks, and she really wanted to try and capture the beauty of nature, and she would spend hours, for example, just wondering whether the water in this rock pool, did it lip, did it lap, or did it foam against the edges? It's that very sort of sensitivity. And Evelyn Cheesman, she talked about these almost sort of primeval chords in her body that what started resonating when she was a child in the beech woods of the North Downs, and when she came on these giant, sort of arboreal giants in the forests of Papua New Guinea, these chords within her resonated really loudly, and she felt part of nature. And I think they all these women felt that there was no separation between them and the natural world, which is why they felt so strongly towards it. And I think that's, if anything, we can learn is about stopping this idea that we're separate. We're all part of the same great miracle that is life. And maybe if we saw nature as being part of us, rather than something to chop down or destroy. Maybe we'd sort of stop it. I don't know.
I mean, I guess just following on from that, do you feel in the women you've looked at, they write about nature differently to how men would do in the same place? I mean, you talked about this with Mina and Leonidas, and I was thinking particularly about someone like Jane Goodall, who kind of goes out and completely interacts with the chimpanzees, I think it's the Gombe in Kenya, in a really different way to how male scientists would like give them names and things.
Yeah.
Do you find there is a different interaction, really, and a different way of seeing nature? You've sort of touched on that already. But
I mean, I think certainly if you look at the sort of nature writings of the 20s and 30s by men, it is very much conquering this virgin peak and all that kind of quite aggressive domination. I think nowadays it's less, I mean, if you think about, I don't know, Robert Macfarlane or someone, seems to be a much, I mean, I hesitate to say sort of feminine sensitivity, but it's not wanting to conquer anymore. It's much more wanting to be with and understand. And but interesting, Mina. So she was very obviously the first, and she was right in the middle of this sort of heroic exploration phase. But she wrote in her diary that where she was most happy was when she was going along these great lakes in her canoe and the waves would almost submerge her, and she rejoiced in this sense of littleness that overcame me, that she was part of it. And I think she and Dorothy being the sort of the early ones, probably more interestingly different than later writing.
It's very unmale kind of writing. I've conquered this peak and shot this lion. And any final questions anybody would like to ask before we go on to the important drinks and books? In which case, please join me again in thanking Sarah. Before you thank Sarah, I would like to remind you that there's a book signing. Please you can continue conversations outside. Our partner Fox Lane Books will be selling books, and we'll also have drinks. So please do partake of that just outside this lecture theatre. But thanks once again, Sarah, for a really rich and wonderful talk.
Thank you.